Well, hello everyone, and it's my pleasure today to be interviewing potholer54, also known as Peter. Did you ever call yourself Peter, or is it just potholer? What should I call you?
Oh, potholer's fine. Everybody knows me by potholer, or pot is okay. So if you want to get familiar, pot's fine.
So, I mean, just to explain this, I don't typically talk about climate change on my channel, but how can I put it? It's not really a topic that I'm super into, but it is something that I've always wondered. Like, well, I tend to look at things through an economic lens on my channel. And when I follow the incentives, when I follow the gap between people's what people say and what people do, when I look at the flow of money, when I look at who tends to advocate as opposed to and then all of their other views, these are the sorts of things that lead me to start to wonder and to start to question. And so I got involved in a bit of a back and forth with another channel, and then you cropped up in the comments. And also, whenever I've talked about this at any time, anywhere on the internet, all anybody says to me is, "You need to speak to potholer. You need to speak to potholer." So here we are. Yeah, before I begin, is there any, for those in my audience watching this who don't know who you are, how would you describe yourself, sir?
I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Actually, I came to your channel because someone, well, actually several people wrote and said that you had done something on climate change and said, please go and do something about this. And I said, well, no, I don't want to make another video about this. I actually, my channel is basically involved with debunking junk science that is now pervading the internet. And it's not just about climate change. It started off actually about evolution and the crazy stuff that creationists were coming out with about the Earth being 6,500 years old. Then a lot of people asked me, you've got to tackle climate change, which I thought would take a couple of videos and ended up being 30 videos. And I've done GMOs. Everybody thinks, yeah, GMOs, genetically modified organisms are going to kill us. And I said, no, let's look at the science. Vaccinations is the other thing, vaccinations and autism. I've even done expanding Earth. So a lot of the stuff that goes on the internet, I've basically very, very simply looked at where that information comes from. And the whole point that I make to people, I'm glad people are now really taking this to heart, is to track information back to its source and find out how it's been changed along the way. So that's basically what I'm doing. By the way, one thing I'd like to ask you, which we just had a quick chat before we came on air, and I didn't have a chance to ask this is going out live. This, presumably I'll be able to download this and put this on my channel, will I?
Absolutely. I would encourage you to mirror it. And
yeah.
I mean, for your audience, I don't really have any particular agenda here. I'm just interested to find out more and to ask some of the questions that myself and other people who wonder about these things want to ask, and see what you have to say.
And I can say also, I mean, I got that impression from seeing your channel that you were open to listening to different sides of this. And in my case, I'd like to hope I'm reflecting the scientific side. I've also been very critical of Al Gore. I've been very critical of environmental groups and people who have exaggerated the science. So I think a lot of what goes out on the internet, Arctic ice disappearing by 2013 and stuff like that, is absolute nonsense. And I've been equally vehement. In fact, I think that's even more dangerous because it purports to represent the science in a way that brings the science into disrepute. So I really want to just look at the science and say, where does this information come from? And let's clear up some of the problems.
Yeah, and I do think that this is some of the things that make somebody like me start to question, because I mean, just I am used to debating or engaging with people who are socialists or advocates of social justice, or and all of these other kind of
that ain't me, I can tell you that.
all of these other sort of right-on causes. And what gives me pause is that I see a lot of the same tactics employed, you know, in the pages of The Guardian, in the pages of all of these other publications who have no scruples in being what I'd call statistically dishonest with things like, I don't know, the gender pay gap, for example, or with things. And when I see exactly the same people then pushing this message, it makes me think, well, hold on, what's going on here?
Yeah, I think the thing is, I mean, I agree with you. A lot of the social science, and a lot of people are asking me, can you cover this and cover that? And I say, that's social science. And I'm sorry to all the social scientists out there. I know that it's a very respected profession and discipline, but it's not the hard science. I did a geology degree, and I was a geologist for a couple of years before becoming a journalist. So actually, I've spent most of my time as a science journalist. I worked for New Scientist for the BBC Science in Action. I still do stuff for the ABC Science Show and for the BBC in various programs. So I've always had a science background and a journalism background, but you know, on the geology side of things, which I'm probably stronger than other parts of science, but I don't really see social science and others in the same category, because that involves an awful lot of subjectivity and opinion. And the great thing about science is you really, you know, when I was at uni, sorry, I'm in Australia, so university, discussion until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on social issues, and it went on forever. And one of the great things about science is it's done and dusted within half an hour. All you have to do is show the evidence, and if people don't have evidence for something, opinion does not count for anything in science. So that's why it's such a wonderful thing. You can wrap things up by 10 o'clock in the evening and go and drink and not have to worry about having arguments going on too long. But should we get into the questions? And
yes, I realise your time is limited, sir. So let me see if I can start open up my first question. This is actually a question that was sent to me by James Dellingpole, who writes for The Spectator and Breitbart, among other things. And
yeah, I know him well.
He's I think fairly well known as a prominent climate change skeptic. And he asked this question. He said, does he, as in does Potholer, even understand the skeptical position? And if he does, what's his defense? So,
well, I have no idea what he means by what's his defense. I don't defend any position. I just report the science. But okay, let's start, because I was going to say this to you anyway, even before these questions came along. The word skeptical to me means a research scientist. Research scientists have to be skeptical. I'll give you an example, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying this. My daughter wrote a paper when she was doing her equivalent of the MSc here in Australia, and her supervisor told her to rewrite it. And I thought it was a very well written paper, which shows how much I know. Mm-hmm. But the supervisor basically said, look, what you're doing in this paper is trying to prove your hypothesis. And my daughter thought, well, isn't that what you're supposed to do in a paper? She said, no, you're supposed to disprove it. The whole point of doing science is if you have a hypothesis, you have to try to disprove it. You have to try to show. That's why I say that scientists are skeptical by nature. I actually had a debate with somebody in Dorset on this subject, and he said, we should have skeptics writing papers. And I said, yeah, but skeptics do write papers. They're called scientists. So this word skeptic is a very misleading word. I have to say, I also don't like the word denier. I think that's a pretty appalling word as well. And I said that right at the beginning of my series on climate change. So I've settled on the word critic. And I hope you'll find that that's a fairly neutral word. People like Dellingpole are critics of climate science. Do you think that's a fair word to use? I don't know what your opinion is on that. I may have lost you, AA. Hello, you there? Okay, you've dropped out. I'll wait for you to come back. I suppose everybody can still hear me on this. So AA did warn me that this might happen, that he would lose connectivity, which he says sometimes happens with his computer. So give it a couple of minutes, he'll come back on board. Go and make a cup of tea or something. Sorry, I can't chat with any of you. Oh, you back?
I'm back. Sorry, I told you this might happen, didn't I?
I did. I'm not sure if I was still live to everybody, but I did warn them.
Okay.
You told me that might happen.
Yes. Yeah, it was my own. I guess my own climate change on my computer.
I was just at the point where I was saying I use the word critics because
yes.
To me, I think critics as being scientists. Is that a fair word, do you think?
Yes, I think it's people who are critical of some of the tactics that we're talking about, and also people who, because they see what I don't know, dishonesty or scientific irregularities or strange things that aren't meant to happen in science, like the shutting down of opponents or the treatment of people as if they were almost, I guess, religious heretics. That's really the angle where I hear a lot of the people, a lot of the people that James Delingpole interviews on his show, for example, tend to have this view that it's not real science that's being done. It's closer to social science, or closer to the sort of science that goes on in, I don't know, a field like nutrition, where people still have these big debates over whether it's fats or carbohydrates or whatever. So that's how I see it. What do you think about?
Well, I'm happy. I mean, to me, the way the reason I use the word critic is because they're critical of the conclusion. Whether you and I would probably differ on the other aspects of it, but certainly I think we can agree that these people are critical of the conclusion that CO2 has a strong influence on global temperature, which James Delingpole certainly does. And who's the other guy that you had? Forgotten. Tony Heller is also
Heller,
is also critical. So if you don't mind, I'll call them critics rather than skeptics. I find the word skeptics, since it's applied to scientists, kind of very confusing. So if we call them critics, then my basic answer to Delingpole would be, what is the critic's position? Because the critic's position is different according to who you talk to. For example, AA, you take the position, or at least you seem to agree with the position of Willie Soon, since you reprinted his graph in your video. And I'm not sure if you knew it was his graph, but it was a graph from his 2005 paper, showing that the sun is increasing in power. There's more heat, more solar output. Now that's his position. He's a critic, or what you would call a skeptic. On the other hand, there are a lot of people like Anthony Watts, who runs What's Up With That, who says, no, the sun is decreasing. So what is the position? Some people say that CO2 has no effect on global temperature. Some say it has a small effect on global temperature. Some people like John Coleman say that CO2 is too small to be effective because it's only 0.03% and a teeny weeny amount. And yet someone like Christopher Monckton says that CO2 is plant food and it's absolutely essential for the planet and has a huge effect. So there's no skeptic position. I've read something called the Skeptic's Manual, and I also read I saw Molyneux's video on the the skeptic's position in 12 minutes. But that bears no relation to what a lot of skeptics out there are saying. This is why I say they're critics rather than skeptics.
Just one thing. A lot of people in the chat are asking me to ask you to turn your camera off to improve your audio.
Oh, okay, sure. Right. I'll turn it on again only when I need to.
Okay.
I thought for a minute a lot of people are calling in to call me names, but that's actually
okay.
How's that? Is it better?
You can still share things if you need to, even though your camera's off. Just by
I'll share things when I'll put the camera on again when I do need to share something. Yeah. So I'll show you that. Willie Soon thing, because I have that. Sorry, if you just give me a second, let me just find it because I've got it here. Arctic versus correlation. I think this is the one. Yeah. There we are. Yeah, I've got it. Right. Let me get that up for you. And then everybody can see what we're talking about, because some people might not be familiar with that video. Right. Now I'm going to go back to Google Hangout. Oh, that's disappeared. Oh, it's got here. The academic has left the call. That must be an old.
I'm still here. I'm still here.
Yeah, you're still there. I got several pages up, which obviously Google Hangout has a habit of keeping these pages. Now I've just got to find. Damn.
Yeah, I think you have
Sorry,
to share
this is not. I will share it as soon as I can find the thing again. Hang on. I've got so much stuff up here. My apologies to everybody. This won't take long. This won't eat into our 40 minutes. I promise you. I'm just wiping off stuff that's on there.
Yeah, don't show anyone the password to your YouTube account. It'll be hacked by Delingpole.
Oh dear, I've got so many Google. Oh, here we are. Okay, screen share. Now, okay, that means I have to click on that. There we go. Now we're in business. We're getting there. We're getting there. Now I've got to find poor old Willie Soon's graph. Once I got this done the first time, it's going to be easier the second time. Now, hopefully, when I switch the camera back on,
we can see this. Yep.
You can see. Oof, God, that took a while. I promise you, the next time I try and find something, it'll be a bit quicker now that I know where it's going. Okay, this was on your video, and you were using this as an example, as Willie Soon did, that Arctic temperatures are following solar output, or total solar irradiance. You can actually see the scale on the left-hand side is in watts per square meter, which is how TSI is standardly done. But he shows it increasing over the last 40 years very clearly. You can see, if you look at the timescale at the bottom, the last 40 years shows an increase. And yet, Anthony Watts, just about every other so-called skeptic or critic of climate science would say, no, that's wrong. It's been increasing, and in fact, decreasing. And in fact, it has been decreasing. That's very clear because they can take measurements from satellites of the output of the sun directly, and it shows a very clear increase. Now, I'll give you another graph which shows that. First of all, here's the PMOD graph from the Max Planck Institute. I'll put that up on the screen and then screen share that. Okay, there it is. now, this is the actual measurement of total solar irradiance. This is a satellite which measures the output of the sun. So you can see quite clearly from that it's going down. Now, this is not controversial. As I said, this is not just something that is a debate between scientists and critics. I'm going to show you another graph here. This is from Climate for You. And Climate for You is not by any means a site that is sympathetic towards the conclusions of many scientists. So I'll just bring that up for you. And again, now this is measuring something different. This is sunspot numbers. Sunspot numbers are very closely correlated with total solar irradiance. So this is why they're often used to show the amount of solar activity and the amount of sunlight that we're getting. Again, if you look back over the last 40 years since 1980, very, very obvious decline. I could show you the one from What's Up With That, but believe me, it's going to show you exactly the same thing. So here again, we have a problem in that Willie Soon is putting this information out. It's been picked up by people all over the internet, and it's passed around blogs and all sorts of other things, and people believe it. Now you put this on your website, and you presumably thought that this was a legitimate and authentic piece of information, but just, that's what I mean by tracking things down to their source. If you actually check the source of the information, you can discover where that comes from, and check the information to see if it's accurate, and it's not. So this is why people know, scientists say that the sun is not responsible for recent warming, because it's been decreasing at a time when global temperatures have been increasing. Now, you said in the video there's a one-to-one correlation, but clearly the correlation actually is negative. In other words, if there is any correlation at all, it is that as the sun gets cooler, the Arctic gets warmer. Now, that is obviously not the kind of correlation that makes any sense. Well,
I seem to remember that it wasn't a correlation between temperatures and the sun. It was a correlation between CO2. Wasn't it CO2 levels and what the sun has been doing?
There were two things that you showed in that graph, and let me just get it up again, and I'll show you, because there were actually two graphs there. So let's have a look back at the yellow one, which is the one you showed on your video.
Right.
You're looking at it now, right?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Now I'm just going to have to look at a bigger one so that I can see the scale on it. Now the one on the left is Willie Soon's graph from his 2005 paper showing total solar irradiance against Arctic temperatures. What he's showing there is Arctic temperatures going up since 1960, and fair enough, that's probably what the temperature record shows. I'm not sure. I think it was a record in Reykjavik he was taking or something, but we do know that Arctic temperatures have been rising. But alongside that, or superimposed on that, is a red line. Now that's in the left-hand graph, and the red line is showing total solar irradiance going up. Now, when you talk about trickery and skullduggery in statistics, he is showing an increase in solar irradiance which is not there in order to make it fit a temperature rise that is there. Now, on the right-hand side, the one you were referring to just now, here we've got carbon dioxide in the red line, and we've got Arctic temperatures in the gray in the background. And again, it looks as though there is no correlation, but I don't know exactly where he's got these figures from. I hope he hasn't manipulated this to the extent that he manipulated the other one. But if we look at carbon dioxide levels in comparison to global temperatures, because when we talk about global warming, we are talking about global warming. There might be differences in Reykjavik that may not be impacted by carbon dioxide. There might be some local thing there to do with temperature measurements that I don't know about. I haven't looked into that graph, but what I'm saying is you can't take these things at face value. You have to look into it. The first time I saw Willie Soon's graph on your video, yeah, I was impressed with it. I thought, wow, yeah, that does look as though it correlates. But as soon as I saw that that was total solar irradiance, I thought, no, there's something fishy going on there, because no one in the scientific community, even the measurements that are being taken directly of the sun, show that there's any kind of an increase.
So I do have one question here, which is that, and again, this is more from the economics point of view, but one of the things that you're always taught to do when you're looking at things economically is not to look for a single. It's seldom the case that there's a single cause for any given historical phenomenon, and then to be skeptical of people who look for single causes. So could it not be, I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate here a bit, could it not be that both the sun and CO2 play a role here, and that it could be, you know, some of one and half a dozen of the other? Why would it not be that?
Oh, okay, but the thing is, there are three main drivers of climate, and I'm talking about active drivers of climate. It's actually a rather complicated thing once you get into the passive drivers. But the active drivers of climate are the sun, carbon dioxide, and aerosols. And as a geologist, I mean, looking back over 500 million years, these are the things that have basically set the global temperature. And they're no different today than they were then. And whenever people talk about, oh, humans are causing this, I say, no, humans are not causing it. Humans have been on this planet for 150,000 years, and we haven't disrupted the climate. It's carbon dioxide. And once you understand it's not humans, it's carbon dioxide that does it, then everything else falls into place, because you can see the correlation throughout geological history. So yeah, the sun and carbon dioxide together are the influences. Now, in the short term, we're talking about decades and perhaps 100, 200 years, which may sound long term, but there's actually, let's say, medium term, because in geological time, that's the blink of an eye. The sun, since it has been declining in solar power, in solar output, or TSI, total solar irradiance, whatever measure you want to make of it, would actually have a cooling effect. Now, I don't think anybody would deny it. I hear a lot of critics, the so-called skeptics, who say, it's the sun, stupid. The sun controls the climate. Well, if the sun controls the climate, how come the climate hasn't been cooling for the last 40 years when solar activity has been going down? In fact, the sun is having a downward impact on temperatures. It's called a forcing, and it's like a tug of war. It doesn't mean that the Earth is getting cooler. Clearly it's not, unless you want to argue about that. But clearly the Earth is warming up. But if the sun is getting cooler and trying to depress global temperatures, as it has been for the last 40 years, something else must be pushing them up. Now, that's not the reason why they know it's CO2. I mean, this theory that CO2 affects global temperature has been around since 1896. It's not new. It's not the least bit controversial in the scientific community. So that's not the reason they know, but it just is so consistent with the theory. And that's what scientists always look for, is consistency. That if these are the three main drivers of climate, then there should be a consistency of when they are in this tug of war, one against the other, that the temperature should be responding to that tug of war. And it is. Now, when you talk about economics, I'm with you. Boy, there are so many different things. I mean, I was laughing when Donald Trump couldn't understand why there was such good news in the United States and the stock market went down. Well, I can explain to him why the stock market goes down when there's good news, and I'm sure that you can as well. It's not rocket science. It's been going on for a long time. And I'm heavily invested in the stock market, so I do understand how economics works. Trying to get a handle on which stocks are going up and which stocks are going down, how the economy is going to go, is an incredibly difficult thing. And I think you'd probably agree with this, partly because you're trying to read human emotions. And to a certain extent, human emotions are predictable. The way that humans are going to behave is predictable. But have you've seen these experiments they do with bubbles, where people know that a bubble is going to happen. You know the experiments I'm talking about.
Yep.
And they know the bubble's going to happen. They're on computer screens and they're buying and they're buying and they're buying. I mean, even though they know that what they are buying on the computer is now the purchase price is far more than what it's worth, and they know that the price is going to decline, they still create these bubbles. We have an amazing capacity for doing things that are totally illogical. But the wonderful thing about physics is, yes, you can have one thing that has such an effect. And the Earth is a very simple system when you look at things like energy in, energy out, because energy and temperature are directly correlated and directly related in a very simple equation. And I've seen economic equations that I can't get my head around. I mean, some of these equations in economics, even if they work, are so complicated, you need a computer in order to work them. So I think you can't really compare the two. And I do get what you're saying about economics. There are so many variables. It's such a chaotic thing. And climate is very similar to that. It's very chaotic, but global temperature is not. Global temperature is actually fairly simple.
I did want to ask my second question on this, which is that if it's such a clear-cut thing, why do you think that skepticism persists, despite what you present as overwhelming evidence in your videos? And I mean, if this is, why is there still a debate about this? I mean, you mentioned...
well, actually, in the scientific community, there's no debate at all. There hasn't been really a debate about this since the 1970s or 80s, and even before that. I mean, the whole point of the whole idea of CO2 changing temperatures has never been a controversial one. It's always been accepted, and no one ever thought it was anything untoward. You've got papers going back to the 1930s, 1950s, 1960s, all very clearly showing that carbon dioxide is a major driver of climate. So that's not a controversial thing. The question is, why don't the general public accept this? Why don't newspaper proprietors and television commentators and people who are not well versed in science, why don't politicians and lobbyists accept it? I do a lot of conversations with people, because this is a very interesting question for me. I'm always, I don't like to argue a lot with the people who come on my channel and post, although, okay, sometimes I do, and they get very irritating. But I'm more interested in finding out why you don't accept this. And then what happens is they give me a statement which is clearly nonsense, which has come off the blogosphere, that I know where they got this stuff from. They just read it, they believe it, they copy it, and they paste it. And to me, that's the opposite of being skeptical. That's why I don't call these critics skeptics. But I then show them, actually, this information is wrong, just as I've just shown you with the Willie Soon graph. And I'm showing you the actual measurements of the sun show it's been decreasing instead of increasing. Now, you would have thought that any rational human being seeing that and seeing the evidence and seeing the measurements and even seeing other skeptics who agree with that, other critics who agree, would say, oh, you're right. But they don't. They double down on it, and they insist that they just change the subject, or they run away, they don't come back. It's very rare that I'll get someone saying, oh, thanks for explaining that to me. Now I get it. I didn't realize I had been misled by this blog. They still have this absolute faith that whatever blog they've attached themselves to must be telling them the truth. There's a kind of an echo chamber. And to be honest, I think this has happened since the rise of the internet, because I've been in this the science business for a long time, and I've been reporting on climate change since the 1980s for New Scientist and others. And I don't remember this this kind of criticism of the scientific community in such a vehement fashion. And it did happen to a certain extent with the ozone layer. And I remember Paul Harvey criticizing it and Rush Limbaugh criticizing it. But despite the fact they had an audience, there was no echo chamber as there is now. People now seem to be very attached to the blogs that they are convinced.
I think a lot of that stuff could easily be explained through what I'd call confirmation bias and heuristics. You know, the Daniel Kahneman stuff. Who can explain a lot of that. But I mean, there are still some questions that persist about this, because whenever I've asked people about this, one of the answers I'll get back is, well, you know, it's a vested interest. They have powerful lobby groups behind them. But if you actually listen to Delingpole and friends, they all present themselves more as victims, as people who have been hounded out and shut down and treated as pariahs, and who have in many cases lost prestige or lost jobs or lost money as a result of it, and yet they still persist. Whereas if you look at the incentives on the other side, the people who push these things through their research, they get rewarded with grants, with government funding, with they have, in many cases, these days they have big business behind them, and one of the things that I thought about was, well, why does that happen? And I do wonder if even let's just grant that everything that you're saying is absolutely, as in there's no debate about the science. Can you still understand people who may be skeptical of the political ends being pushed? Because one thing that does come with climate change is an agenda that says, well, basically the only people who can sort this out are the government. The solutions have to be pushed from the top down.
Okay, hang on. Sorry, there's too many things we're dealing with here. Let's deal with one.
Sure.
I know I'm very familiar with these arguments, by the way, and they really astonish me. I wanted to go back to the first one, and I should have been taking notes, and I can't remember now what the first. But let's start with the grants. Now, having grants to do research is basically how scientists do things. It doesn't matter whether you're an oceanographer or a climatologist or a geologist or a geophysicist or whatever field you're in. The reason people get into research is because they are incredibly interested in learning how the world works. I've interviewed hundreds of researchers over the last 30, 40 years, and one thing that they really share is a passion for finding out how things work. And let's face it, that's not just a nerdy thing that interests them, but if they want to get anywhere in life, if they want to win a Nobel Prize, the way you do that in science is by showing something that nobody else has discovered. You don't do it by repeating what everybody else has already done. This is what makes me laugh when people say, oh, they're just sort of towing the line. What they're desperate to do is actually show something different. And getting research grants doesn't mean that you then get loads of money to live a fantastic lifestyle. It's actually quite the opposite. The people that go in for research are normally the top of their class. You don't go and get a PhD if you're stupid. And you work in the field of academia, so you know that. These are the brightest and the best who normally get PhDs, go on to universities to teach, and primarily to do the research. That's why they take these positions.
But I mean, what I'm referring to here is, I mean, some of the stories that you'll hear is that, I don't know, somebody wants to do research on squirrels, okay, I don't know.
I know what you're going to tell me, and they relate it to climate change, and therefore they can get their money. Exactly. Okay. There's no surprise about the fact that as climate change becomes a more immediate problem, more research is going to be done on it. I'd like to know any field of science where that has not been the case. When HIV/AIDS came into the fore in the 70s and 80s, there was a huge amount of research went into that, not just in medical research, but in social sciences, a massive amount of research because it was a problem. When we had plate tectonics, now this is my field, when plate tectonics came up, and I did my degree a long time ago, plate tectonics was still basically in the hypothesis stage back then. Once people understood that earthquakes were caused by these moving plates, a huge amount of money was spent on research. But this is done not to line the pockets of researchers. This is done for a very good reason. Because once you understand that earthquakes are caused by plate tectonics, they're not just faults that for some random reason are moving that we can't understand. We now understand the mechanism behind us. Then we need to really investigate this. And through all that research, we now have a much clearer understanding of where earthquakes will strike, when they might strike, and how big they might be. And as a result of that, engineers can then either retrofit buildings or the building code can be changed in order to make buildings more secure against earthquakes. So yeah, a huge amount of research goes in every time we identify a problem. I'm not sure why that is a mystery or why that means that the research must be bad. I think what people think is that because these guys, and by the way, squirrels and global warming, I don't know if that's ever a thing, but it's possible. But it doesn't mean that you then fake your results and you have to say that there's global warming by faking results. That would be the end of a career. So any scientist who has decided to go into the field of research instead of into the very lucrative field of lobbying for companies or working for a corporation in doing commercial research, they would have absolutely no interest in faking results, and even less interest in having that fakery discovered and being stripped of their careers and their reputations. It does happen occasionally, but the thing is, just saying that as a matter of principle, because they're getting grant money, they must be faking their results is a bit of a stretch. I think I would like to see evidence of someone faking results rather than just insinuation.
And the other thing that people talk about, and I do want to get to, I should say that a lot of people sent me questions, and I realize we're running out of time. I do want to get to some of them, but one of the things that has stuck with me when I've been, and like I say, this is not my primary area of interest, and I think this is part of it as well, because it's going to take a lot of time and effort to go through these things, and it may not be everybody's number one priority to think about climate change. So you kind of have to draw your conclusions kind of quicker than you might in other areas. But one of the things that I think about is why is so much money pumped into technologies that we know aren't the optimum one? So I'm thinking in particular of solar energy and of wind power, and some of the companies behind that, some of the research behind that, and some of the special interest groups behind that. Now, and this is, I guess, where we move away from the actual science behind climate change itself and move into I guess the politics or the economics around climate change, and how some of these things may put wind in the sails of those people who are inclined to think that there's something else going on here. A lot of the stuff I've been most convinced by when I've looked at this is people who have shown that solar energy is very inefficient, for example, or that there have been big companies behind wind power being pushed onto areas which very probably would be better served with a nuclear power plant, for example. Why do you think that these things happen? Why is there such an interest in wind and solar as opposed to nuclear or other alternative technologies?
I honestly couldn't tell you. All I know is I was in China recently, and I met with a guy called Huang Ming, who's a billionaire. He's known as the Sun King because he owns a place called Solar City just south of Beijing. And I spent 3 days with him because I was doing a profile on him for the BBC. And one of the questions, first of all, he made his money as an engineer by designing what you see now, a very familiar thing. It's a vacuum tube, which you fill with water. Have you just gone AWOL? Okay, I think I've lost you. Okay, we'll just wait a few minutes for AA to come back on the screen. And while I'm waiting, I'm going to bring up some other graphs as well, which we'll be looking at. We've gone way over our 40 minutes, never mind.
Hello, I'm back again.
Hi, you're back. Okay.
It's terrible. I'm going to have to get a new computer, I think, which is a shame after I've invested all this money in this one. But there we go.
Get a Mac.
Do I have enough time? Because I realize.
Yeah, we have run it, but we had a few delays and stuff, and the reason I was a bit more concerned about the length of time I'd be putting this on my channel when I do come to doing it. But I think with all the stops and starts, that won't be a problem. Now, I can't even remember now what we're talking about when you just left.
So I'd asked you about the pushing of wind and solar in particular.
Yeah. Sorry, and I was talking about Huang Ming, the solar. So he invented this solar tube. He's an engineer, and it's basically a glass vacuum chamber which allows sunlight in to heat a black chamber with water in it, and then this then circulates around the house. And it was a very simple device that just is a passive solar heater. You put it on the roof of your house and it gives you hot water for nothing. It's free. Okay, there's an initial cost, but assuming you don't break these things, they can keep on giving you water forever and ever. And there are now millions of these things across China. I mean, for one thing, the government's making great strides there in reducing air pollution by trying to go over to wind and solar, and this is a good example of it. But they've been very successful, actually so successful that I got one myself, and I now, here in Australia, I don't boil up water in the kettle anymore. I use one of these water heaters. I can't understand people who say that it's not economical. It is certainly not economical in some places. In others, it is. And one of the great things about the way that, okay, the solar panels originally were not very efficient. They're getting much more efficient now. But the Huang Ming has actually running a lot of his solar city on hot water. Even the air conditioning now is run off hot water, and it's a rather complicated thing. But if you're getting hot water, boiling water, you can then take energy from that to run a cooling system. So instead of having photovoltaic, you can actually have hot water running these things. There are all kinds of other things that are going on in Spain, for example, in California, and now in South Australia. They're using the sun to melt salt. Now, molten salt is incredibly hot. Are you still there? I think I've lost him again.
Okay.
I don't know where you left me, but anybody who was listening in would be hearing this anyway. So I did go on a bit at length. But the bottom line is, I said to Huang Ming, "Do you see environmentalism and capitalism as incompatible?" Because this has always been a big thing with me. He said, "No, not at all. In fact, there is complete compatibility between a clean environment and private enterprise." And one of the things you said that rather shocked me was that that the only solution to this is governments. And I've always felt very strongly that it's not. Now, we're getting very much away from the science. We're getting outside of my area of expertise.
I did want to ask you one thing when it comes to this, because it would be remiss of me not to ask you this. I remember years ago I read the book Freakonomics, and there's a case study in there where they basically argue climate change is nothing to worry about because the free market is going to find a solution, and it's going to be to do with, I don't know if you've heard this, the ash cloud solution. That is when there was that volcanic eruption. There was a layer of ash, and it actually cooled the temperature. And so they think, well, maybe if they can engineer a solution to release a kind of thin layer of ash into the air, they could actually turn the temperature up or down depending on.
Yeah, this is one of the stupidest ideas I think I've ever heard. Okay, I'll tell you why it won't work. Who's going to pay for it? Can you imagine the bickering among all the world's countries of a problem that, I mean, for example, the United States doesn't, the present government says the problem doesn't exist in the first place. Why would they pay billions of dollars for a solution to a problem that they think does not exist? And if we have an America First policy, it would be up to other countries to do it. China wouldn't want to do it. Russia wouldn't want to do it. Russia's probably quite happy at the moment. They're the only country that actually might get some benefit out of this. It'll be opening up the Arctic for them. And if by some miracle you got all the world's countries coming together at the United Nations to agree to put up all this pollution, because that's basically what this ash cloud is, it's going to fall back down to earth. You're not going to be able to keep it up there. You have to keep regenerating it. What happens if, let's say, there's a war between two superpowers and nobody is interested in maintaining this? You then have a buildup of carbon dioxide, which will all of a sudden, once you have this beautiful aerosol shield taken away, will then have the effect that it's having. It's rather like having an infected leg, and instead of going and getting antibiotics, you just put a sticking plaster on it because you don't have to look at it anymore. That really is not a solution.
Another question that some people sent me as well, which is, if this is such an urgent issue, okay, why aren't places like California and other coastal regions either A, making plans to evacuate, or B, putting up coastal defenses? So essentially they're pointing out a gap between what people say they believe and what people are actually doing. What is your view on that particular one?
My view is the world is run by politicians. And two things politicians want to do. One is they want to be popular and they want to be re-elected. They're looking ahead. I mean, look, I don't have a problem with that. It's Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. You know, the people, ironically, who are doing more about this are the Chinese, but that's out of self-interest. Because they can look 20 years ahead, and we've now just had Xi Jinping be elected president for life. What he does now is going to affect what will happen in his presidency 20 years from now. So they can look ahead. Politicians in the United States and Britain can't look ahead more than a few years to the next election. If they start taxing people to the hilt in order to pay for walls, which wouldn't have any effect, by the way. I mean, the sea can get around a wall. You'd have to wall the entire continent in order to have any effect. But they're not going to start spending money on that. Besides which, the solution, I would have thought, and I'm not an economist and I'm not a politician. This is my field. So we've gone a long way from talking about the science. But the solution would seem to be that we become more energy efficient, which can't be a bad thing. We find new ways of creating energy, which can't be a bad thing. And we find ways of reducing the amount of energy we use, which also can't be a bad thing. And that is up to the free market. That's up to private enterprise. That's up to innovation. I'm with you that I don't think this is something the government should be involved in. Are you still there?
I mean, there could, I guess, a lot of the people on the free market end of the spectrum, the reason why a lot of them will line up with the climate skeptics is because climate change is used as the Trojan horse for government intervention and for regulation, so that they can then be they can pick the winners. As essentially, they can choose who gets the contracts. They can set all sorts of conditions, and this in itself prevents the free market from doing its thing. It prevents the creative destruction, which historically has been the thing that has made us more energy efficient, from taking place. So is this an intractable, I mean, I guess it's more of a political thing, but is it an intractable problem where if the climate change issue is hijacked by the interventionist left or the far left or the radical left, that it's very difficult then to allow the free market to do its thing to actually find a solution to this problem?
Well, I don't know what that means, hijacked by the far left. I mean, it's just a fact of life. I mean, unless you know anybody's going to okay. I'm afraid I don't see these things in left and right terms. To me, the left is just as nuts as the right when they start attacking science, and they do. And I mean, the GMOs issue, where we have a lot of leftists saying that GMOs are frankenfoods and give you health problems and so on. And also, there are a lot of people on the left who exaggerate climate science. So I don't think, it's not really a left and right issue as much as it is science against those who don't understand the science or don't accept the science. Now, as regards to policy, well, what policy you make out of it depends on who you vote for. And of course, if you allow the left to get into positions of power and ride roughshod over this and do whatever they like, then more fool you for voting for them. I mean, at the moment, we've got a Republican Party in power in the United States with a president that doesn't accept climate change. But this hasn't changed the science. We had William Harper in Canada, and we had Tony Abbott in Australia, who also did not accept that CO2 had a major effect on climate. The government that's in power does not alter the scientific facts. Scientists in the United States now are still saying that CO2 has a major impact on climate, even though the entire government and the EPA is against them and says, no, it's not. So it's really we've got to separate out the science from the politics here. Scientists are going to give the scientific message regardless of who is in power. And if you don't want the left to get into power, don't vote for them. That's all I can say.
So I do want to try to steer us. I don't know how long you've got, but I do want to steer us back to the science, because I have a friend called Shinobi Yaka who is into looking at the data, and he has asked me that the graph that I posted, the IPCC AR4 and AR5, seem to display a divergence between prediction and observation. Even if we ignore any potential bias, the pattern does seem to be common between both sets of graphs. And what is his explanation? So what he said, I think this is the divergence between the models, what the models predict, and what the actual observations are. And I think his point is, if a model fails to be predictive, how reliable is the science? I think is the ultimate question here. I mean, would you agree that a theory has to be predictive to be worth anything?
That's one of the reasons why most scientists accept and understand climate change. The predictions have panned out. I think he's talking about this graph. You can see it there, which was on your website. Yeah. Now,
then he sent a more one from the IPCC, which is essentially an update of that, which shows a very similar thing. So this is what he's talking about. Yeah.
I that one I don't have, but this is the one that was on your video, because I was going to talk about this one anyway. I took a look at this, and it was apparent to me right at the beginning that it's got problems, so many problems, that it clearly didn't come from a peer-reviewed scientific paper. And in fact, I said that in my comments on your website. I said it doesn't have any margins of error, which you would always get with estimates like this. It's showing mid-tropospheric temperatures. Mid-tropospheric temperatures are 20 kilometers up. And it's showing only those mid-tropospheric temperatures in the tropics. So you've got a very small part of the world and a very small part of the atmosphere where the models apparently, according to this graph that hasn't been peer-reviewed, don't work. But that's ignoring the place where we actually live, which is the lower troposphere, where the models actually have been very good. The IPCC, way back in 1990, predicted 0.2, I think it was 0.2 to 0.5 and degrees per decade, which is pretty much what's happened. It's somewhere in the region of 0.2 to 0.3, depending on whether you include the aerosols or not. So the predictions have been very good. I actually did a video on this recently when Molyneux was interviewing Christopher Monckton, and they were talking about models. And Molyneux didn't fact check any of this. He just accepted whatever Christopher Monckton was saying. And I looked at this, and I was actually quite surprised myself, because I assumed that, well, models, computer models, I don't understand them. But how can you predict something in the short term when you've got so many unpredictables? And one of the big unpredictables was the economic growth of China and India, which have put up a lot of aerosols, which, as we know, have a cooling effect. And yet the models from 1990, which were very crude, have actually come to be very, very close, almost a perfect fit with what's happened. There was a paper that was done about this, which I quoted, which had a look at the models, and it did show that they were very good. So yeah, you can probably cherry pick halfway up the atmosphere. In one particular spot, they might have got it wrong. But in the rest, I would say, that's something's coming up on my screen. That's you, is it?
I'm trying to find the can everyone see that? What I'm showing there?
I've got the entire screen full of lots of folders and pictures. So
let me see if I can bring up the I guess the updated or the one that my friend got from the IPCC, because this is the one. He's basically saying that you can see very similar results in this one, regardless of the biases or not. I guess his basic point is that in those ones, I'm trying to get it up here. Hold on.
That's all right, because I'm going to be bringing one up as well, and this is the IPCC. I have to say, I never quote the IPCC in my videos, so I'm not necessarily going to defend the IPCC here. But if we are talking about their prediction,
can people see this
now? Oh yeah,
I've made it a bit smaller.
Yes, but when was this? This is from what date?
He did. Well, I don't have that info. I was just sent this by a friend of mine who said
it looks to me. Is that a 5-year running average, or what is it? I don't even. Is it a 5-year running average? This.
I don't know. He got. I know he got this from the I know he got this directly from the IPCC.
I would. I mean, honestly, I'd be happy to look at it. But my first instinct would be to say, okay, what is it representing, and what exactly? Because I don't read IPCC reports. I have to admit, this is just a hobby for me. This isn't a passion as it is for a lot of people. But I've got, I don't know if you can see on my screen there, this is from the 1990 IPCC prediction of global temperatures. I think this is 1990, rates of increase in global mean temperature of about 0.2 degrees C per decade, scenario B, which was the kind of, I think that was a scenario where CO2 levels wouldn't go up as much as expected. And 0.2 degrees centigrade is pretty much spot on with what we've had over the last 30 years. So I drew a graph myself, and don't ever take any graph that I do as being a perfect representation. But I did look at the scenario B representation, and I'm just going to see if I find it. And is it come up on your screen or not?
Yeah, I can see it. Yep.
Okay, that's the scenario B in light blue, and that's against NASA's temperatures. Now that takes it up to, I think, 2014, 2015, which, and you know, there was a slackening off of the rate of warming because we had a period of lower solar emission. We also had a lot of La Nina, strong La Nina years, which absorbed a lot of heat from the atmosphere that went into the ocean. You're not going to expect global temperatures to go up in a straight line. They never do. If you think from January to July in Britain, if you take the daily temperature record, you're not going to see it go up in a perfect straight line to correlate with the fact the sun's been getting brighter.
I think the point is that there has been a divergence, hasn't there, between the observed temperature and what the models predict. The models,
well, not according to
hot, as they say.
Not according to the research that I've seen, and I've looked at papers that have looked at the results. There certainly was a divergence in the early 2000s, but like I say, you're not going to get it following in a straight line. But most of the research that I've read on this says the models have been very good. They're very accurate. There's still really no difference to the original prediction that a doubling of CO2 will cause warming of around 3 degrees centigrade. That most of the results still cluster around there. And that doesn't just come from computer models, by the way. Computer models are just one facet. And reason I don't have a lot of faith in them is just there are too many variables in short-term computer models. They're done for the sake of policymakers so they can get some idea of how much temperatures are going to rise in the next 10 or 20 years. But I wouldn't expect them to be accurate. I'm quite surprised that they are. As a geologist, I am much more interested in looking at how temperature has responded to carbon dioxide increases in the past. And you can take a lot of periods in the past where these can be measured. And you take a given amount of CO2 increase in concentration, you look at the temperature response to that, and you can do that over and over again throughout the geological record. Gives you a very good idea of how much of an effect CO2 has. And interestingly enough, that comes out almost exactly in the same place that a lot of the computer models come out at, a lot of the volcanology models come out at. And, you know, the fact that they're all agreeing with one another is another, what's the word, another piece of evidence, basically, that is consistent with CO2 being the strong driver of global warming that they think it is. Can I just step in here a second, AA, and just show you something that came from your video?
Absolutely.
Because this is, I was waiting for your questions to come through. To those who don't know what the background to this was, AA was going to send me some questions. They came through at the last moment, so that's why I'm not familiar with one of the graphs he's just shown me. But I did spend the time answering some of the questions he put on the video, which I recommend you go and see. It's on his web, on his channel. And what was it called again? Response to
Gralesta, I want to say. Because I wasn't even planning to make a video on climate change. I tweeted a few things out, and somebody made a video, and then respecting the time-honored tradition on YouTube, I thought I better respond. So this is, and if you notice, I presented it as 3 questions as opposed to anything else, and you've been answering these questions.
The other one actually is quite an interesting one because it comes back to the nature of skepticism. Can I show videos on this thing?
Well, you can have a go. I don't know what's going to happen, but let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens. I'm looking for it, and it doesn't seem to be coming up on. Hang on, maybe that's why it's not coming up. Let's try it now. Oh yeah, here we go. I'm going to show a video now. I hope I'm not going to be hard on you, I promise. But this is from your video. Here we go. Oh, better start it.
That's right, the utter failure of the models accurately to predict the temperature. In fact, the actual...
Sorry, that is the wrong one. That wasn't what I was going to show. I was going to show the one on the 1663.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. Now I looked into this, and it's actually got a very interesting history, which will answer your question perfectly, I promise, as soon as I can find it. Okay, there it is. Now let's get back to share screen. Get that one off. Got so many things open on this page. It's ridiculous.
I daren't actually touch anything on my computer because it's been so temperamental this morning.
Okay. There we are. Why? There we are. Why 1772? So let me try this one.
This is not the graph that climate change evangelists like to share. They like to share this one, which starts the story in 1772. Now, this makes things look much more scary, but they've achieved this alarm by eliminating the context of the previous 100 years of pre-industrial temperatures. My question is, why do this? If it's just about the data and just about an honest look at the stats, why is there this statistical skullduggery going on? I mean, it's not like it's the only time they do it either.
Okay, I'll come on to that one in a minute, but I'll just deal with this first graph, the 1663 graph. Now, I tracked that down, and what I discovered was that I'm going to show you the original paper that was done on this. By the way, you're still there, are you?
I'm still here, yeah, but don't worry.
Okay. Sometimes when I hear a silence, I can never be quite sure. This was now, are you seeing a paper called a New Daily Central England Temperature Series?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Now, they give you the answer right there in the abstract. The original one, which was 1659 to 1973, was actually produced in 1953 and then again in 1974 by the same researcher, a guy called Manley. And he went through the temperature record and produced that first graph that you showed. Now, if I scroll out of the introduction, what you'll notice is they've taken away the first 100 years. They've taken away 1659 to 1772. Now, you call this statistical skullduggery, and I can understand your suspicion, but the explanation here is that, okay, I'm going to have to find it. If you read down in the introduction, you'll see the places. Okay, Manley 1952 used a few outdoor temperatures, observations of snow or sleet, and likely temperatures given the wind direction to establish relationships between the unheated room and outdoor temperatures. These relationships were used to adjust the monthly unheated room data. Now, what it boils down to is that the data prior to 1772, between 1659 and 1772, was, first of all, it was monthly, it wasn't daily. It was an estimate, and it was a temperature that was taken indoors in unheated rooms. Therefore, it has I think the margin of error on that temperature data was around 1 degree. Now, in 1772, the data set that they had from that date was daily. It was temperatures that were taken outdoors and therefore far more accurate. And they estimated that the margin of error on that temperature data, probably because of more sophisticated measuring equipment, was about 0.1 degrees. So the margin of error prior to 1772 was 10 times more. And it was a monthly data set. There were all kinds of reasons why it was actually a rubbish data set. Had they used it and spliced it with the 1772 data set, which they could have done, they would have been harshly criticized for doing that, because you're measuring chalk and cheese. You can't get a decent relationship out of that. Right. So you see what I'm saying? That was the reason it was done. Now, what interested me was that you asked me earlier, why don't people believe the science? And it was interesting that you assumed that this was due to statistical skullduggery. And you use words like alarmist. And I think, and I like I say, I don't want to be critical. I'm not being critical of you. I can understand that that would be a natural reaction, probably because you saw this on a website, or I think someone sent it to you. And immediately alarm bells started ringing in your head, and you fumulated and started cursing.
It also goes back to, coming from looking at economic data. I see this trick done all the time in political debate. So it looked like, this is a standard move. They're talking about, I don't know, unemployment or something. You start it in 1960 as opposed to 1940, for example, and you can tell whatever story you want, right? So I thought something similar was going on here without really looking into the underlying data, if that makes any sense. So I will say, I was guilty of just making that assumption.
I really respect you for accepting that. If this had been a conversation on my channel with some of the people that I sometimes get into conversations with, they would have changed the subject at that point. And I very rarely meet someone who's intellectually honest enough to say, oh yeah, fair enough, that's what it is. I think, though, you might be beginning to see why it's an uphill climb for those of us trying to represent the science, explaining, no, this isn't necessarily something that is skullduggery. And I gave you the example when I wrote that comment about the NOAA sea surface temperature data. Everybody assumed that was due to them trying to change the temperature data in order to make it look like there was more warming than there was, and there was nothing of the sort going on. I spoke to the researchers actually who did that project, and it was so clear to anybody who understands how the science is done that sort of thing is not happening. And if it was, these guys would have been fired. That wouldn't have been tolerated, because in science, unlike in economics or politics, it's very transparent when you're trying to cook the books, and it's not something that's tolerated. But I can give you a lot of examples of this kind of thing, because Delingpole comes out with all these things all the time. He will see something and someone tells him, oh, there's skullduggery going on here. So he then publishes that. And when you actually look into it, no, there's a little bit more to it than that. And I think we've covered the three things and that were on your channel. And I hope that we're beginning to see we've generated a bit of light rather than a lot of heat, which is refreshing. And I'm so glad to be able to have that kind of conversation. Sure. And by the way, and back to you, because you had some other questions for me.
Well, I mean, these are questions that have come from people. I put out a tweet a few days ago just saying, like, does anybody have any, potholers coming on for this? Does anybody have any burning questions? One of the ones that came up time and time again, and I'll just try to conflate these into, there's a few different ones, but I'll just try to formulate one question here, which is consensus really something that you should lean on in science? So I think the point here is that there's a lot of leaning on consensus, as the stat that is often brought out is the 97% of scientists agree on X, and this is really the so one question is, why this emphasis on consensus as opposed, because this is something else that I see in the economics field. It'll be like, well, 97% of economists from the LSE agree that minimum wage is a good thing. And it's
whatever they agree, it must be the opposite.
Right. And so I do. So this is I think a valid question to ask.
Yeah.
Why do you think consensus is pushed above the actual data so often?
I think this started when, and I've been following this for a while, and I do remember that in the early 2000s, there were a lot of cries from those who were opposed to the conclusion that, oh, there's no consensus among scientists that CO2 causes warming. This was one of the arguments that was being made. There's no consensus. Scientists are divided on this issue. And as a reaction to that, some people did attempt to gauge some kind of a consensus. I did a video on this because I was fed up with people talking about the consensus. And one of the questions I asked was, how do you know what the consensus among scientists is in anything? How do you know that the majority of geologists agree that plate tectonics causes earthquakes, for example, in my field? And which geologists are you going to poll? Don't poll me, for goodness sake. I was a geologist. Do I count? Do you only poll research geologists? What about petrologists? What about sedimentologists? What about paleontologists who might not know anything about seismology? So do you only poll seismologists? Do you only poll those who are doing research into plate tectonics? There's just no way of knowing what the consensus is in anything. Science has never, ever been decided on consensus. Now, what is confusing here is that there are two different estimates that were done, and they both came up with 97% on two completely different things. One was a random sample of research scientists in climatology or climatologists. I'm not sure what the criteria was. Those lucky enough to be made, to get on the list, were asked, do you think CO2 causes warming? 97% said yes. That doesn't mean that's representative, and you can discount that. It's meaningless. Science is not decided by consensus. So the way science, the way science is decided is for anything, and this goes for climatology as with anything else, is the evidence. And the way the method that's been used for the last 200 years is that evidence has to be peer reviewed to make sure that there are no errors and obvious factual errors, not censored in any way. It's just to make sure that the methodology is sound, the calculations are right, that everything has been, the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed. Then that goes for publication, and then that can be commented on by other researchers, and that is part of the open and transparent thing about science. And that debate could go on for decades. If a paper is flawed in some way, that would be responded to. What happens in science is you do get this debate, and plate tectonics is a very good example of that. So is the Big Bang Theory. You have these opposing views about why we get earthquakes, or is the universe in a steady state, or did it start from singularity? Over time, more and more evidence accumulates, more and more is published, and that evidence points so clearly in one direction that the people who were opposed to it either come on board, or if they're still opposed to it, they've got no argument left. They cannot find any evidence to contradict the evidence that's been published. So the way that science is decided, what gets into the textbooks in your school and your university, is science that has been published and has not been refuted. Once it's in there, and after decades, it's normally accepted. It takes a long time. There's a saying in science that science advances one funeral at a time. You have to get rid of all the old fogies who still have this mentality of the way things were in the 1950s or wherever, in order to let science advance. But it's a slow process. But we've had this global warming theory now for 120 years. It hasn't been overturned. The amount of evidence has been accumulating on top of it. Now, this is where that other 97% that you're talking about comes in, because this was a separate survey that was done, not of scientists, but of the scientific literature. And they searched thousands of articles, and I can't remember how many there were, on climate science to see whether they were consistent with climate science. They didn't necessarily have to endorse it and say, yeah, climate change is real. Just as anybody writing a paper today doesn't have to say that plate tectonics causes earthquakes. We know it does. They don't have to say evolution, natural selection causes evolution. That's well known. It doesn't have to be put into every paper. But the paper has to be consistent with the scientific conclusion that CO2 is a primary driver of climate. And 97% of the papers they looked at found that. So the other thing I will say, AA, is every single major scientific institution in the world has made its declaration on this. And if you look at the National Academy of Sciences, the Union of Geophysicists, the Royal Society, the Académie Française, all of the major scientific institutes all over the world in meteorology, geology, any field, oceanography related to this, they have all said that CO2 has a major effect on climate. I don't know how much more you can get to of getting a consensus unless you poll the entire planet. But certainly, consensus has no value in science whatsoever. But if you want to know what these scientists are thinking, the ones who actually follow this, that's pretty clear.
So I did have another question about consensus, which is it was really a question about types of consensus. He said, if they believe in the consensus, then why are they seemingly unconcerned with the other consensus that it's already too late for the ice caps? Why aren't they worried about London being underwater in 50 years? Why is that their main point of concern? So this is like, this is saying, like, why is the focus on, I guess, CO2 and climate change when it should be, I mean, this is a variation on that question I asked before, but any answer to that one?
Okay, I think I get the question. Why? Okay, there is a focus on London, though. I mean, I think every government now has got mitigation plans to take account of future sea level rise, London especially. And in fact, London isn't one of the worst to be hit. I mean, London has flood defences now, and I've seen a list of the major coastal cities that are in danger from sea level rise. London is quite low down on the list, funnily enough. New York is quite high because the east coast of the United States is going to suffer more from sea level rise than other parts of the world. Places like Bangkok, Singapore, obviously Venice, Tokyo, they are all in danger. This is something that's going to cost a lot of money. This is why it's so amazing for me that the people who don't want to do anything about climate are the ones who are saying, we don't want to pay any money. Well, that's actually the opposite of what you should be doing. If you've got a hole in your roof, you should be fixing it now for a small amount of money than waiting for it to get to the point where our children and grandchildren have to pay huge amounts for it. But
probably what gets me to my last question, actually, Peter, which I think is probably a meatier question, and it's from our friend Steve Goddard or Tony Heller, right? He says the Arctic is not melting. It is time for climate scientists, democratic politicians, and the hashtag fake news mainstream media to stop lying about this. So,
okay, now let's apply a real skeptical position on this. If someone told you, all the scientists are saying that the ice caps are melting. I mean, all the scientists who are doing the research, NASA and Danish Meteorological Agency and everybody else, all putting out these pictures and these graphs and everything showing the ice is melting. When someone comes to you and says, no, it's not, what would be your first reaction to that? Would you say, oh, okay, then that's good? I mean, surely, if we're going to apply a skeptical principle to this, we should say, what's your evidence? This is the way that scientists think. Okay, that's fair enough. You've got a hypothesis, you've got a proposition. What's your evidence for that? Now, what is his evidence?
I think the basic claim is that the cycles that we see have been going on for hundreds of years. That the Arctic, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but from what I've seen from Tony Heller, he basically points to a very long geological timeline, and he says, well, if you look at ice levels here, 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 and here, they were up, and if you look at them here, here, and here, they went down, and they go up and down. And this is as natural as anything else. So that when David Attenborough shows, polar bears dying, this is not really, this is just kind of emotional blackmail as opposed to real science.
Oh, I'll agree with that. It is emotional blackmail. I think, polar bears, I had this thing with Stephen Crowder about that. I said, polar bears are basically irrelevant. They've got nothing to do with whether CO2. It's used by environmental organizations, and it's a pull, it sort of attracts people to it. But when they discover, if you've got a polar bear on an iceberg, that it can actually get off and swim and get to the ice, then they think, oh, well, hang on, you just tried to pull the wool over our eyes. Now, why should we believe anything you say? The polar bear situation, actually, before we get on to what Tony Heller said, polar bear situation is not very well known because it's very difficult to count polar bears. The surveys that have been done, because they're lone animals, they live in the wilderness, it's very difficult in those conditions to actually do numbers. So all the research I've read says it's very unclear whether polar bear numbers are increasing or decreasing. But let's get back to what Tony Heller says. Climate cycles, I presume, and he obviously didn't tell you, but I presume he's talking about glacial and interglacial cycles. Yeah. Do you know if that's what he was talking about? He's talking.
I think I've seen graphs from him that go back thousands of years showing estimates.
Well, we're on my turf now. This is geology, so we're on my turf. I feel a bit more comfortable here. Well, again, when I was doing this, we weren't quite sure what was causing these glacial interglacial cycles, and a lot of research was being done into this. And in the last, actually, the idea was floated about 20 years before I did my degree, and this shows you how long it takes before a hypothesis actually makes it to the classroom and becomes scientific, scientific fact, for want of a better word. The reason that we have these cycles is that we are in an ice age. At the moment, we're in an ice age. It's an interglacial period, which is a beautifully benign climate. This is what gave us all the civilizations that sprang up. But we are still technically in an ice age. And you have these glacial periods when the ice sheets advance and the interglacials when they retreat. Now, the reason they happen, and this isn't a certainty, but this is the scientific theory which has gained a lot of traction and seems almost irrefutable at this stage, is that the Earth goes through regular wobbles on its axis. And it also has a rather eccentric elliptical orbit. And when you get these combining in a certain way, as they do on a very regular basis about every 100,000 years, it gives a little bit of extra sunlight or a bit less sunlight to the Earth. Now, when it's less sunlight, it causes a glaciation. The ice sheets advance. When it gets a little bit more sunlight, the ice sheets retreat. That's not to say the sunlight is the reason the ice is melting. The sunlight is giving a little bit of warming to an Earth which is in a very precarious position, because during an ice age, ice has some fundamental qualities, which means that if you melt a little bit of it, you get less reflective sunlight coming off, more sunlight goes into the ocean and warms the ocean or the land. Also, the permafrost melts as the ice melts, and you get carbon dioxide and methane, which turns into carbon dioxide, breaks down into carbon dioxide, being released. So you get these secondary factors. And then because the air warms, you get more water vapor, and that's also a greenhouse gas. So that sunlight, just a tiny bit of sunlight, will trigger positive feedbacks, which can melt ice sheets the size of continents. Then you get the reverse happening. Now, this happens roughly every 100,000 years. We came out of the last glaciation roughly 20,000 years ago. You know, these things happen fairly steeply in geological terms, but you give or take several thousand years. The next one is not expected for another 20,000 years, and we won't start the decline into the next glaciation for another 20,000 years. We have about 16,000 years of this wonderfully benign climate, as long as we don't mess it up. Now, Tony Heller's idea that, oh, these things come and go in cycles is fair enough if you're talking about the glacial cycles over the 100,000-year period. What he didn't mention was that the next cycle is not due for another 16,000 years. So we know, and the reason they know this is because these wobbles are very, very predictable. You can look at a graph, you can see how predictable it is. We know that you're not expecting one of these over a 40-year period in the late 20th century. That's just not because of,
just for my own understanding, in between these I guess vast glacial time frames, does the temperature remain relatively constant during that 20,000-30,000 years, or does it actually fluctuate and go up and down? I mean, as things stand, just let's pretend there were no humans a second and there was just dinosaurs on the Earth or something. Would you expect this temperature to be going up gradually or down gradually, just based on the glacial?
You would if the sun was having an effect, and the Little Ice Age is a very good example of that. We had the Maunder minimum, which was a very low solar activity, and that plunged the world into a mini ice age. It could actually, if the sun had really stayed out for long, because of the feedback effects, we could have actually gone into another ice age. But the sun doesn't do that. The sun goes up and down in a fairly even way, and it can take us into warm periods like medieval warm period or Roman warm period. Whether or not the medieval warm period was caused by the sun, we don't yet know, but that's a very likely argument. And when the sun is very dim, it can cause these cooler periods. But if you look at the temperature record, these aren't huge swings in climate. You don't get massive, great meltings of ice sheets. You don't get the kinds of things that we've been seeing over the last 40 years. And if it was the sun, we would know it because solar irradiation would be increasing. And as I said earlier when we were talking, it's clearly been decreasing. So if there was going to be any effect right now, it would be a very, very slight decrease in temperature. And if Tony Heller wants to say that this is part of a natural cycle, he has to explain what this natural cycle is and what's causing it. It's not being caused by Milankovitch cycles, the Earth's wobble, because that's very predictable. It's not being caused by the sun, clearly not being caused by aerosols, because they've been increasing and aerosols have a cooling effect. So if he thinks this ice retreat in the Arctic, but anyway, he said the ice is not, you told me he said the ice is not melting in the Arctic.
Yeah, he said it's not melting.
Well, I don't know if he's saying it's part of a glacial, if the melting is part of a glacial cycle and yet it's not melting. I don't understand what he's on about. It would be interesting to have something concrete from him, what it is he believes, what the reasons are, and to show the evidence for that. Because I mean, there are satellite pictures being taken of Arctic ice since 1979, and they clearly show that Arctic ice has been reduced. I think the figure is about 40%. Arctic sea ice has been reduced by about 40%. The Greenland ice sheet is melting to the tune of around 150 cubic miles a year. That's been measured. And I mean, you know, you can toy with these numbers a little bit, but there are various ways of measuring it with gravitometers, which measure the thickness of ice sheets, and measuring the melt runoff and things like that, measuring water temperature, water salinity, all kinds of different ways of measuring these things. And they all come to the conclusion that there's ice melt, and glaciers are retreating all over the world.
And just to be clear, there's a chap in the live chat at the moment who's saying, he says the sun has surpassed all other factors on most major computer models for climate change. That's basically something that you refuted earlier on, right? You do not agree that the sun has surpassed or replaced all other factors.
I'm not going to agree or disagree with someone who can produce some evidence, but what I can tell you is that all the measurements that have been taken of total solar irradiation, and even the so-called climate skeptics, the people who run the blogs, don't even dispute this anymore. It's so well known that Anthony Watts doesn't dispute it, and Climate for You don't dispute it. Isn't Climate for You run by Tony Heller? He's got one of those websites anyway. But the graphs that I showed you earlier, whether you're looking at sunspots or measuring directly from space the amount of radiation coming from the sun, they all show a clear decline, and they're all showing the same amount of decline over the same amount of time. So if someone has written into you to say, oh, I've got some evidence to show the sun's increasing in solar activity, yeah, I'd love to see it. It might be a misunderstanding. It might be what they're saying is the sun has been the major factor in climate change since the end of the last glaciation over the Holocene. And I would agree with that, because carbon dioxide levels actually leveled off about 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago. CO2 levels have been running between 260 and 280 in a line, sorry, going that way, pretty much for the last 10,000 years. So because CO2 has been constant, it hasn't been having any effect on climate during most of that time. The variable has been the sun and volcanic activity, and those are the two things that have had an effect on climate. Now we suddenly get a very, very steep increase in CO2 concentration from around 270 up to over 400, and at the same time we get a very, very steep rise in temperature. Doesn't prove, and you can't prove anything in science, doesn't prove that CO2 is the cause of that. It is simply evidence that is consistent with the theory that's been around for 120 years, that CO2 has a major effect on temperature.
I guess this is probably, I don't have any more prepared questions, and I think we're getting towards the end now. But
my computer is down to 10% charge as well, so it's a good time.
I do have one, I guess, more philosophical question, which is, what about those people who argue that all of this is basically what I'd call human hubris, or a human overrating of its own significance on a kind of mass scale, and that what we're seeing is, in effect, a kind of mass confirmation bias of our own importance, or our own inflated importance? What would you say to people who come up with those sorts of arguments?
Yeah, it's funny. I hear this. I think Charlton Heston said the same thing. What suffocating vanity! It was what he called it. And I've heard a lot of people. There was a weather forecaster on TV said that it was arrogance to assume that we could change. It's funny because I remember Rush Limbaugh in the early 90s saying the same thing about the ozone layer. It was arrogant to assume that we could have any effect on the ozone layer. Now, I don't know whether you accept the science that CFCs have an effect on the ozone layer, but you could say that about anything. It's arrogant to assume that we could have overfished the oceans. It's arrogant to assume that we could have plastics in all the rivers in Britain, which came out the other day. I don't know if you saw that news item. It's arrogant to assume that the little bit of plastic that we humans insignificantly produce has now made its way to every ocean in the world. It can be found all over the place. You can say this about anything. This is why I say, look, let's get away from the emotion of this argument. It's a silly emotional argument. We're not dealing with whether humans cause climate change. You can sit humans on this planet and they can sit around and do nothing. They're not going to have any effect on the climate. It's not humans that are causing climate change. It's carbon dioxide. Now, once you get into that argument and say, okay, well, if it's carbon dioxide, is carbon dioxide causing climate change? Well, yes, it's done that in the past. It's done that over the last 500 million years. We know why it does that, because we know that it absorbs and re-emits radiation. So we know the theory behind it. And we can see that it's doing that now. All the evidence, past, present, and in theory, all come together and tell exactly the same story. So never mind about blaming ourselves or saying we're guilty, or is this some sort of religion with a sin, or we're too arrogant to think that we can do this. Humans have been able to accomplish a lot, and one of the things we accomplished very successfully is putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, unless you want to say that the carbon dioxide increase is not due to all the coal and oil that we burn, that's a different issue. And there's plenty of evidence to show that it is. But we do know how much coal and oil has been burnt. We know how much carbon dioxide we put up there. So to say that we can't have an effect on the planet is to say that a 33% increase in CO2 can't be having any effect on global temperature. And that means that CO2 has no effect. Now there you're going against the science. And let's stop the emotion and try to argue the science, and you'll be up against a brick wall then, because very hard to argue against the science on that.
Being a flawed and self-interested human being as I am, I guess my obvious question is, what should I do now? I mean, I'm plotting in my head, well, you know, if these timescales that he's talking about are right, should I just like move to Utah where I'll be safe, or like what's
okay. It depends. Look, you know, you're not going to get, if you have no kids and you really, you know, not interested in leaving money to anybody, go and buy a house by the beach. It doesn't matter if that's going to be, you know, storm surges are going to be lapping at the doorstep in 80 years time. It's not going to matter to you. If you are a bit concerned about what to do, you know, someone said to me, well, you know, you should have, I think this was one of your questions, why don't you have oh no, it was on my channel, sorry, someone asked the question, why don't all these people then try and reduce their own carbon footprint? My carbon footprint actually is atrocious. I travel business class, so I really have no excuse. People would be appalled at the amount of carbon I'm using, but that's not the point. Individually, it's a wonderful thing if 10% of the population who really care so much that would stop driving their cars or whatever. But that's not the point. What we have to do is collectively say, okay, look, this is not the end of the world. This is a problem. We've faced problems before. We know what the solution is. The solution is become more energy efficient and get our energy from other sources. Let's start putting money into technologies that are going to produce that energy. Let's start innovating. Let's start let the private enterprise system, the free enterprise system, come up with a solution. Now, when we were talking earlier, one of the interesting things is, and I've heard people say this, yeah, but let's just wait until there's a solution before we start thinking about whether this is a problem. That doesn't happen. The way humans work is when they see a problem, they come to a solution. It's like lead in petrol. As soon as we realized there was lead in petrol, we got rid of those old catalytic converters, and there was a new way of doing the petrol, putting petrol through a car. Yeah. Gasoline, if you're American. The same thing happened with CFCs. CFCs were destroying the ozone layer. What did we do? We didn't say, oh God, well, nothing we can do about it. We still need our hairspray. We did still have hairspray. We just found a different propellant. And it was private enterprise that came up with that. And companies that can innovate and companies that can do that are the ones that are going to get ahead. And that's the way free market should work. Governments can give them a nudge, but government is not necessarily the answer.
I guess one of the practical issues that we see, and this is something that they brought up on that. I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure that you've done some debunking videos on it. The Great Global Warming Swindle. It was a film that was made a few years ago.
Yeah. You want to talk about fraud in graphs? Yeah, go on.
One of the things that did seem to be an argument that is difficult to. I mean, I'm talking about the solution end of this as opposed to the science, and that is, it's all well and good to sit in Europe or to sit in America or to sit in first world nations in business class, and I can nip out to the supermarket and get whatever I want. I can, I've got my and this I'm revealing this. We have got 4 different bins for different recycling here. We try to do our bit and do our best for the environment, but they will.
Sorry, could you hold on 1 second? Yeah. I'm so low on battery. I'm just going to get my charger and bring it into this room. Sure. Give me two secs.
Just waiting for him now. Hi, Bill. Glad you can join us. See if I've got any Super chats.
Geez, now I've got to find a place to plug it in. Sorry, I'm just plugging in now. And yeah, you were talking about recycling plastics, which is commendable.
So yeah, I mean, we do our recycling here. We try to be try to do our bit. Of course, I live in a middle class, first world bourgeois area. My friends are right on all the rest of it. But they will say, well, yeah, all of Europe, all of Australia, all of Japan, all of America could become 100% energy efficient tomorrow, and it still wouldn't solve the problem of China and India, and in particular the third world, and what they talk about in particular in the climate was the global warming swindle film is Africa. And then you get these kind of essentially social justice or radical groups going to countries that have yet to really been through the industrial revolution properly. And they start telling them, well, you actually aren't allowed to build, you aren't actually allowed to go through the technological development you need to develop as a nation to improve your GDP, etc., because now you have to use solar power or wind power as opposed to getting proper power plants, whether they be coal or nuclear or something else. And this seems to me to be quite an intractable problem, where you have the interests of countries that are currently poor and which need to develop, and all of a sudden you're basically getting us in the Western world or us in the first world essentially condescending to those countries and saying, well, look, we have these nice things and we've had the benefits of them, but you poor people over there, you're not allowed, because if you carry on doing, you're going to wreck the planet. And I'm just trying to imagine having a conversation with somebody in India who has a diesel taxi, for example, and it's their livelihood. This seems to me a much more difficult problem, because we're dealing with millions, if not billions, of people. So do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. I travel for half of the year on assignment, and I've come across this firsthand, and I can give you some great examples. I don't buy this at all. Firstly, I think these are crocodile tears from a lot of people who really have an agenda against the idea that carbon dioxide causes warming, and therefore they're finding all kinds of ways that they think might appeal to the bleeding hearts of this world. Oh, but it's poor people in other parts of the world. I've always found that the people in other parts of the world love having these alternative sources of energy. And I'll give you an example. There's an island in the Philippines where they live by fishing, and they've got sort of small electric lights and little things, and they run off 12-volt batteries. And every now and again, they have to take their boats over to the nearest town where they charge up their batteries, and it costs them $3 to charge it up. And this is running off a diesel power generator, and then they take their boats back to the island where the batteries run for about another week until they have to do the whole process over again. Someone introduced some solar panels there and hooked it up to the entire village, and they now run on a 12-volt grid. And it's beautiful. The lighting works. They now have television, which they never had before because it just used up so much power. And they got all the benefits of that. And I'll give you another example in Morocco, where they had a motor-run pump, which was the only pump for the well in the village. And it was constantly going wrong because sand would get into it, the motor wouldn't work. They had to bring in diesel to run it, and the diesel was expensive. And someone had the bright idea, once it got bust and they had to get it fixed at great expense, why not put in a solar one? So they put in a solar pump, and they haven't looked back. They get tons of solar energy because they're in the south of Morocco, so there's lots of sunlight. I've mentioned the fact that millions of Chinese now have these passive solar heaters on their roofs. and they get hot water for the first time in their lives. And those that did have hot water before were always having to chop down the local forests in order to get the timber to burn their wood stoves. It's a very inefficient thing to be running in the middle of developing countries where the roads are very difficult to get through to, and diesel is expensive, and fixing these things when they come across problems is very difficult. Suddenly you get a technology that actually works in the middle of nowhere, and they're adopting it, and they're very pleased with it. I'll just give you one other example. While I was in Solar City, I've just heard a noise. Does that mean you're still there?
No, it's an indication I've had from some.
Okay. I'm sorry I'm going on at length. I'll give you one more example, because this is another telling one. You know the problems they're having in Nepal. It's a cold place because it's up in the Himalayas. So they're cutting down a lot of the forests to burn fuel for cooking. And the result of that is denudation of the forest. And when it rains now, it goes onto bare slopes, and you're getting landslides, you're getting silting of the rivers, you're getting erosion, all kinds of other problems. There was a delegation that came from Nepal to see Huang Ming in China, and he had given them originally a solar cooker, and they loved it so much they came back and he donated a second one. And this idea now is picking up over there. And a solar cooker is basically the same kind of vacuum tube that I was talking about that heats up water, but it's got a couple of wings on it that direct sunlight in there, and you can cook at up to 600 degrees. So you can barbecue meat inside there, you can cook vegetables. And there was a guy from Canada who had one of these things, and he said that he can actually, on picnics, he cooks when it's -20. As long as you got sunlight, it can heat these things up and cook. Now, this is not only much cheaper for them, but it's saving their environment, because they know that cutting down the trees is damaging the environment. They just don't have any choice. It was the only source of fuel they had. So once people learn the facts, rather than the sort of crocodile tears and the bleeding hearts, I think there's a very different story to be told. And I actually recently put solar panels on my roof. Now, I didn't do this because I thought, oh, this is a good thing for the environment. I did it because it saved me money. I've halved my bills now. I've got a different water heater now, which is a compression heater instead of an element. And I put solar panels on the roof. Once we get a battery, which will be the next step, and that will be the next technology goal, I think, is to have an affordable battery system for the home. You will find it much, much cheaper to put solar panels on your roof and run your house on a battery than to go into the grid and pay the extortionate rates that you have to pay for burning coal, turning that into steam, turning that into electricity, running that electricity down the lines to your house. So it makes economic sense, is basically what I'm saying, or it's beginning to.
Yeah, I know. The only thing I would add to what you said is that I know from the free market side, the argument has always been that the way to cut down on what they call the tragedy of the commons is actually to privatize more of these areas, because you only get problems with things like deforestation in places which aren't actually owned by anybody. So that's one of the arguments
That's a very good argument. People tend to, it's like when they sold the council houses in the UK. And suddenly people started looking after their homes. You remember that? I don't know how old you are, but this is going back to the Thatcher era.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and everybody, all the social scientists were saying, oh, you have to have affordable housing for everybody, and basically, if you were in your council house, you were in your council house for life, and your children got it after you, and so on. But they didn't look after them. They assumed that the government would take care of any problems, any leaks or painting or anything else. But as soon as they were privatized, people actually took a pride in their houses, and people do take more of an interest when they own something than when they leave it up to the government. And my, my philosophy on this, and again, I hate to say it, but it's not talking about science, it's talking about now politics and economics. But I think it's not the government's job to get involved in being the solution to this. They have managed to solve pollution problems by basically saying, take the lead, for example. Lead is a pollutant. We need to reduce the amount of lead that's being produced by cars, and then let the car industry decide how it's going to implement that, and do it in an economical way, in a competitive way, come up with the best technology at the best price. That really is the way that humans work best. I hope you'd agree with that.
Absolutely, I do. Well, potholer, I thank you very much for your time. I do, in fact, I've just noticed I did have one super chat from a long time ago from a chap called Graham Patrick. He said, have you read a book called Cool It? There was also a documentary by the same name. And if so, what are your thoughts? That's Bjorn Lomborg who said that. Have you read a book called?
Oh, well, I've heard of Bjorn Lomborg, the environmentalist from Denmark. I haven't read it. I hate to say it. One of the people often ask me, what books would you recommend on climate? And I say, well, I don't tend to read books on climate, because by the time a book's come out, the science has already moved along. Because it takes so long to research a book and then get it published and so on, that the science is already about 5 years old. So I tend to read the scientific papers and the scientific media. But no, I'm afraid I haven't. Plus, I have to add that this is just one of the areas that I cover, and I only make about 3 or 4 videos a year. So it's not a huge thing that I do. It's one of many scientific issues that I look at, but I guess I've been getting more and more into it recently, as more and more people have been asking me to look at channels like yours and discuss it. But anyway, short answer is no. I'm sorry, I don't know the book.
But anyway, well, thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time and your knowledge, and I simply just hope that people will watch this and consider the evidence, make up their own minds about these things.
And they're welcome to come to my channel and discuss it. It's an open forum to discuss these issues, and just read the ground rules on my channel page, and you're more than welcome. Can I just say one more thing, AA? That one of the things that drew me to having this conversation with you, you're a George Sanders fan.
I am a George Sanders fan. Yes.
I have a trivia question for you. What is the connection between George Sanders and Hercules Grit Pipe Thin?
I have no idea.
Okay. Do you know the Goon Show?
I'm aware of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you have to listen to the Goon Show. The Peter Sellers, Spike Milligan, and what's his name? Terrible. I'm terrible with names. But there was a character in the Goon Show called Hercules Grit Pipe Thin, and he was voiced by Peter Sellers. And Peter Sellers got the inspiration for the voice from George Sanders. And he's an iconic anti-hero. You have to listen to that and listen to Peter Sellers' rendition.
It's funny. I did a stream last night with a guy called the Britisher and George, who's a big and with the topic of the show was old British comedy. So we were talking quite a lot about Peter Sellers last night. So. You should mention that.
Right. There you go. Now you have to look up.
I do hate to end on a sad note, but all of those pings were people telling me that Stephen Hawking sadly has passed away.
I heard that just the news tonight here. Yeah, that's boy, but he went on a lot longer than he was expected to, didn't he?
He did. Well, Potholer, thank you very much for your time, and like I said, do feel free to mirror this on your own channel. I think
great. And if it's proved popular, if people like it, and I think it was a great meeting of minds. I mean, I'm very happy to do it again, but I'm going away on assignment from the middle of April, so I probably won't be contactable for about 6 months, and then I'm back here again. But it's been fantastic, and thanks very much indeed, AA. You've been a scholar and a gentleman.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr. Potholer.
Okay.